Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I am having a little bit of difficulty here, you guys. I just want to make sure everyone can see my screen here. All right, if everyone could hang on one moment, please. I'm trying to fix some technical difficulties. Hang on one moment, folks. Jermaine, I am going to try to switch. Let's see.
Okay.
Sorry, everybody. Jermaine, do you have the PowerPoint up by chance?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I'm going to change you to the presenter and see if you can run this.
Okay.
Okay. Apologies, everyone. I'm having computer issues today. Alrighty, Jermaine, we can see the screen.
Okay.
I can go ahead and I could just do the first couple of slides and turn it over to you. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's webinar, Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women, focusing on shelter and safe housing. Today's webinar is brought to you by Tribal Law and Policy Institute, Tribal Judicial Institute from the University of North Dakota, the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and our direct service providers, the Amonic Women's Shelter from Alaska, Native Alliance Against Violence Oklahoma Coalition, and the Domestic Violence Program of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Next slide, please.
Okay. Oh, okay, hold on. Now it's not letting me change. Hold on. Okay. There we go. Oh,
Thanks. Just some friendly housekeeping reminders today. Your control panel will appear on your user screen, and all attendees will be muted during this presentation. Once you call into the meeting line, go ahead and enter your PIN number, and if you have questions, please feel free to type those in. On your control panel, third from the bottom, there is a question box, so go ahead and type those in, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the webinar. And just a couple items, if you look at handouts, which is second to the bottom, we have the PowerPoint slides that we will be going over today. If you're interested in downloading those, go ahead and do that. At the end of the webinar, we are going to, there's a short survey. We would really appreciate it if you could all take this survey. It's only a few questions, should take just a couple minutes. So that will pop up at the end of the webinar as you close the webinar out. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. Thank you, and with that, I will turn it over to either Lana or Jermaine. I'm not sure who's next.
Hi, this is Lana Hunter, and I am the tribal victim specialist here at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I am from the Sissetawan, Wakbetawan, Imataha, Sisseton, Wapitan, Oyate, and my father's people are the Tlingit Nation. So I am here today to assist Jermaine in any way that I can, but primarily my role is to send out information about webinars, also information about how to request training and technical assistance, and to connect with folks around the country who would like to receive any kind of training, information, and resources. So today's webinar is focused on shelters and safe homes, and that is actually one of the areas that we focus in for training. And we do this in partnership with our partners, and on your screen you can see that these are the partners that Chia mentioned earlier. But with the Tribal Judicial Institute, they really focus on the legal aspect or the legal training. And we will have a legal series of webinars coming up for August, September, and October, focused on tribal protection orders enforcement, looking at what makes an order valid in either state, federal, or tribal courts, and really understanding what the legal intersections are with the state and federal guidelines. And so those are coming up in August, September, and October, and that will be with Michelle Rivard Parks of the Tribal Judicial Institute. We also are working with Jermaine, who is our presenter today, and she can introduce herself. I just wanted to say quickly that the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence are really 18 tribal coalitions around the United States focused on ending violence against Native women, and specifically trafficking, as well as looking at sexual assaults specifically. So I would just say that it's a pleasure to have Jermaine on our call today, because she brings a wealth of information, not just from the direct service providers perspective, but also from the coalition perspective that focuses on policy, as well as advocacy for Native women and tribal communities. We are also working with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. So one of the goals of our project is really to look at ending violence against Native women in the lower 48, as well as in Alaska. And because the issues in Alaska are so specific to jurisdiction, as well as isolated geographic communities, we really needed a partner in Alaska on the ground, looking at the specific issues around sovereignty and safety. And so we have partnered with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And this is our logo, the Tribal Response logo, that is representative of the various partners, including the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, which I work for, as well as our partner, our colleague Bonnie Claremont, who works with us on coordinated community response and sexual assault resource teams, and as well as Chia, who is on our phone, who presented just opening up. She works on tribal court dockets as well. So next slide. And because the content is directly affecting Native women and children who may be seeking shelter, who are fleeing for safety, and because it's such an issue around the country, we thought it was important for us to partner with direct service providers, and those are what you see on the screen is the Great Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, as well as the Amonic Women's Shelter, which is located in Amonic, Alaska, and the Native Alliance Against Violence, which is one of our tribal coalitions, but also direct service providers. So I will turn it over to Jermaine to introduce herself, and then we'll move into the next slide.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jermaine Omish Lucero. I am a tribal citizen of the Rincon Band of Luiseño Indians in Southern California, San Diego County. I have been working as the Special Projects Director for the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence since 2016. As part-time and voluntary, and then working on this project, also working part-time, but actually getting paid now. So that's always nice. And it's been great working with all the partners and the programs in this with this project. I've been working as a domestic violence, sexual assault advocate and specialist for over 20 years now. And so hopefully some of the stuff that I have to share coming up will actually really give you some good guidance and some baseline things to consider in regards to running a shelter. So I'll turn it back to you. I went blank. Lana.
Thank you, Jermaine. Next slide. So why are we here today? We're here today because this is an issue that has reached epidemic levels for Native women. I would say that at least half of Native women have experienced sexual assault and or domestic violence in their lifetimes. And this is an issue that at least 1 in 10 Native women, or at least the issues around murder or homicide, are 10 times higher than that of any other race. In addition, we're looking at stalking, and stalking is one area that we really need to have tribal legal responses and remedies for, because stalking is one of those things that now moves over into electronic stalking, but it is also an issue that affects our Native women. At least 25% of Native women have experienced stalking in their lifetime. And just so folks understand the context, that much of the reported cases, we also know that there is so many unreported cases. So these numbers potentially could be higher. And so this is why many of us have dedicated our lives to this work, and either have been affected directly by the issues in our own lives or in those of family members that we love and care about. So this is an issue that's personal to all of us doing this work. Next slide. So when we first started with this project, it was actually brought to us by the Office on Violence Against Women, who is also our main partner and funder. And they really wanted to look at the issues affecting tribal communities that do not receive OVW or Office on Violence Against Women funding. So this was why this project or initiative was created, to really respond to those tribal communities. And we would say at least probably 80% do not receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. And so when you're looking for a tribal response and training, technical assistance needs, many tribes have those needs, but may not have the resources to request or receive that direct technical assistance. And that is what this project or initiative is for, is to really understand those needs at the ground level, but also build a baseline of safety for victims, and also looking towards offender accountability, because you can't have safety without accountability. It's almost impossible to hold offenders accountable or have victims be safe and not have the others. So this project is really about that baseline safety, basic needs, safe shelter, safe homes, coordinated community responses or sexual assault response teams that really involve all of the disciplines or partners, law enforcement, tribal judicial, any tribal court, as well as tribal advocacy, and it also involves our communities, because without our communities holding offenders accountable, it's also, part of the work that we do is around community education and awareness. So this is really that baseline safety and understanding that without this critical groundwork, that many tribal communities may not either provide critical victim safety and or offender accountability. Next slide. So one of the resources that we have for folks, I would encourage each and every one of you to visit our website, www.tribalresponse.org. In all of the areas around coordinated community response, sexual assault response team, shelters, and legal response, we have really tried to put some critical resources, booklets, pamphlets, toolkits, videos, and really tried to create a resource, one-stop shop where you could go to find information about how to write a victim safety plan, about what a tribal code may look like around domestic violence, sexual assault, and or stalking. We even have some resources that touch on sex trafficking, even though this project does not fund sex trafficking training. We also have information about teen dating violence as well as stalking. So I would encourage each and every one of you to visit that resource. Next slide. And under each of the areas, as I mentioned, there is a specific page dedicated to each of the training areas that we're committed to. So for Jermaine's presentation today, if you would like to seek or find additional information, please send us an email. We will give that information at the end, or please visit our website and click on Shelter and Safe Housing. There are some critical resources that have been loaded there by advocates, by Jermaine herself, to really assist you in either developing, sustaining shelter or safe homes. So I would like to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Jermaine, to present today's webinar.
Hello, everybody again. Jermaine here, and hopefully that you'll get a lot out of this and this presentation. And please, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. And if I can't give you the answer today, I'll research it and get it for you. Please feel free to write down your comments that you want to present to us, so that way we can make it more personal to what you guys are looking for. So when we're talking about how victims are kept in abusive relationships, most of it is because of fear. They have a fear of being killed themselves, fear for their children or other family members, fear of the abuser threatening or causing harm or death to self. A lot of times, you know, fear of being tortured. Homicides typically occur when a victim is attempting to leave a violent partner. So this is the most dangerous time for anyone who is fleeing a situation. So we always, it's very important that if you're working with clients already, or if you're considering working with clients, the thing to make sure is, especially at this critical time, is to have a safety plan. So we have samples on the website, but there's so many you can actually download. Just type in victim safety plan or domestic violence safety plan in your cursor up on your on the web internet, and you can get a lot of information on how to create different types of safety plans. That is very critical to help, you know, to get victims into safety. That is one of the critical things. Like we said, I can't stress it enough that this is a very dangerous time. A lot of times people think, and I have to say that I was guilty of this before I even started doing this work, because you think it's like, well, why don't they just leave? And there's so many factors that keep a person in an abusive relationship. So how do they are kept in abusive relationship? The main thing is financial dependency. So if you don't have a job, or you don't have any means of work, or you may have never had a work experience, so you don't even know how to go and fill out a job application, or you've never actually worked at all. So that could be very intimidating for a person trying to leave an abusive situation, because they don't have any concept of what that entails. A lot of times in most of these situations, the perpetrator is the one who controls the money, takes the paychecks. If that person does have a job, a lot of the victim, if that person has a job, a lot of times that's the perpetrator will control how that money is spent, what it's spent on, and they're not. And a lot of times I've seen in relationships where the victim is actually given like an allowance, or they have to keep detailed like receipts for anything that they spend money on, so that that perpetrator knows exactly, like if they're given $20 to go to the store, the perpetrator wants to see the receipt and have the change back exactly, so they know exactly what that person has been spending the money on. Fear of not being able to be support the children if they do leave. I mean, in most of these situations, when there's children involved, that's one of the #1 reasons why a victim doesn't leave the perpetrator, because of the children. A lot of times, you know, they're afraid that how are they going to provide for their children. Another one is location. So a lot of times, you know, being on the reservation, we're in isolated areas where there's like no bus system going around. You may not be any taxi service. A lot of times the roads are, not paved, so they're dirt roads. A lot of times there's no electricity or phone service in a lot of these areas. Living near or the perpetrator's family on the reservation is a lot of times a factor. If you try to leave and you go back home to your parents, but then your parents' home may live next door to the perpetrator's aunt or grandmother or even their parents. So a lot of times that's where you'll get a lot of the stalking, where the perpetrator will use their relatives or friends or acquaintances on as a means to continue the perpetration of the violence, stalking, harassment, and such. Emotional isolation is not being allowed to talk to family and friends. That's one of the other things that really happens in these types of relationships, is that at first it starts off all beautiful and everybody's in love and happy. And then as time goes on, the perpetrator usually will isolate that victim by not allowing them to have see their family or their friends, or go to family functions or feasts or traditional gatherings and such. So just by keeping them isolated really has an effect on the psyche of a victim. Another reasons how they're kept in abusive relationships has to do with housing. So in most situations, there's lack of funds to secure safe housing, lack of available or affordable housing. Even if that victim is able to leave, where are they going to go? And then when they do find a place, are they going to be able to find tribal housing, or are they going to have to move off the reservation? Are they going to have to find an apartment or a house? And are they going to be able to afford that? And then in some situations on reservations, depending on your housing authority, sometimes they have rules or restrictions and can be evicted due to domestic violence. I think a lot of that has changed with HUD since VAWA 13. A lot of the HUD regulations regarding domestic violence have changed, where a lot of times the victims or the people can't lose their house because of domestic violence. But is still a possibility. So that's something that's very important to check in your local tribes and tribal authorities to find out, what are the rules and regulations regarding that housing authority under that tribe. Limited services. So most of the time there's inadequate medical care or access to medical care under Indian Health Services. So a lot of Indian Health clinics and whether they're urban or on the reservation have medical care, but a lot of times they don't have the specific like counseling or therapy for domestic violence. A lot of times they don't have domestic violence or sexual assault advocates that can help in these types of situations. Lack of knowledge of available resources in those areas. So a lot of tribes, if they're very isolated, they may not have access or even know what services and resources are available to them and other in the areas around them. A lot of these places don't have cultural healing. There is not any ongoing support systems. A lot of times when the children are involved, Child Protective Services can threaten to take the children away. Historically, there's a fear of losing our children. Until 1978, when ICWA was enacted, our children were being taken from us just because we didn't live up to the standards of dominant culture. So that has always been a fear of losing our children. And when you compound that with domestic violence, it even makes it a bigger barrier that victims have to face in the possibility of losing their children. A lot of times the implication of a child is from two different reservations, or there is a non-native parent. That makes a big difference as well. If you have the perpetrator is tribal and they have a tribal house, but the victim is either from a different reservation or they are non-native, then what does that parent do or that victim do, and especially when it has to do with their children. ICWA doesn't cover custody cases, so in this situation, ICWA would not apply, but there's still those factors that involve, you know, when you have a non-native parent or a parent from a different reservations in these types of situations. Other factors that influence victims to remain in unhealthy relationships, you know, a person becoming homeless, gender roles, cultural or religious constraints, drug and alcohol dependency, unrealistic views of family dynamics, having two parents is better for the children, a codependency or unhealthy attachment to the partner, guilt, feelings of responsibility. These are just some things that keep people in bad relationships. Sometimes it comes down to just, you know, what we've been taught all our lives growing up, that, you know, well, you know, my parents stuck it out, you know, they fought forever and they're still together. But, you know, and when you compound that with like religious or cultural expectations, that has a lasting effect on why people stay in relationships, and it may not be the best solution for those victims, but because that's how they've been taught since they were young, and it's expected of them to stay in those types of relationships. So it's not healthy. It's better to, you know, figure out what is best for you and your children. So when we're talking about this, and if you already have a program or you're thinking of starting a program, one of the main things to remember is that every person's experience is their own. There's no cookie cutter solution for anyone. So you have to base it on each individual person that comes into your door. You can have like general rules and guidelines of what you expect when a victim comes in, and if they're coming into the shelter, and you have those guidelines set in place, but you have to remember that every person is different. The amount of types of abuse that they've had, the years that they've had abuse, you know, that makes it different for every situation, depending on also the children. Are there children involved versus a victim that's just a single person without any children, but that, you know, they were in an abusive relationship, is going to have different needs in a different situation than a person coming in the door that has even one child versus even a client coming in the door that has 4 or 5 children. So every client is going to be different, and they should be assessed case by case. So there are many reasons why it's difficult for victims of domestic violence to enter a shelter. One of the main things is, you know, finding the shelter for one, but a lot of times there's no beds available, or they're limited to what, you know, how many people can come in. A lot of times they have long intake processes. They require classes, lack of traditional cultural appropriate services. A lot of the restrictions is they have lockdowns where, you know, you have the curfew, and you know, strict curfews that you cannot break, that if, you know, you're 1 minute or 20 minutes late, you know, you could be asked to and removed from the shelter because of that. A lot of times they require that the victims do not work. And in many of these situations, especially in mainstream domestic violence shelters, boys over the age or 13 and over are usually not allowed in the shelter. So if you're a mother and you're trying to find a shelter, and you have a 13-year-old son or older, you know, and you have little ones, you're not going to leave your perpetrator, because you don't want to leave your child, any of your children, at home in that bad situation. And then a lot of times victims do have a substance abuse issue, whether it's drugs or alcohol, and many shelters will not allow anyone who has a substance abuse or alcohol abuse issues into a shelter. So a quote here, it says, "Our community lacks resources for assessing and sustaining shelter or safe housing for victims fleeing violence. Can you help us address this issue?" And so this is why we are here on this webinar today, is to give you guys some of those guidance. So shelter and safe housing is part of this initiative, as was mentioned by Lana, and it's to provide individual training, technical assistance, and resource design to assist tribal governments and tribal communities to strategize ways to access and sustain shelter or safe housing for victims fleeing violence. So when we think about our Native culture, over even before contact, and even still today after contact, we've always had many customs, laws, and traditions that avoided family violence or addressed it effectively in rare instances when it did occur. That was before contact, but even and still today, I know a lot of tribes, I mean, my tribe, we still practice banishment in our reservation. So I know that in today's society, there is still a lot of our tribal laws, customs, and traditions that are still provided that help avoid family violence, and we'll address it when it does happen. So, you know, a lot of times as a tribe, that is one of the main things to look at in your own laws, in your own customs, and your traditions. What do you already have in place, or that you have practiced in the past, that could be reenacted or still really enforced now when you're dealing with family violence in your communities? So survivors recover in stages. So once you leave a relationship, that doesn't mean everything's over and it's done and you move on. There's going to be years and years of different stages. So one of the stages is fear and sadness, denial, working through fears, and growth. And recovery takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. And so when you have a victim coming into the shelter, you're not only dealing with that victim, but if they have children, then you're also dealing with each of those children's traumas that they have to also recover, and that's going to take time. And depending on their ages, that's going to have different impacts on their lives as well. So you have to remember that just because they come into the shelter, that everything's going to be fine and that's going to fix everything. And then once the victim leaves the shelter, that everything is going to be okay and that they're going to survive and thrive. And in a lot of cases it does happen that way, but it's not all the time, and there's going to be setbacks that those victims will have. And so understanding that is one of the main things to remember, because a lot of times when you're working with domestic violence, that's the one thing that we know, that even when you assist a victim, a lot of times those victims will go right back to their perpetrator. And sometimes, you know, you have to have this process repeat over and over again. And the average time that a victim leaves a perpetrator is like 8 to 10 times before that victim finally completely leaves that perpetrator and moves on. So it's not something that just happens. Recovery takes time. But every time a victim comes into shelter, or every time a victim comes through your door and asks for any type of situations, even if it's just, you know, to go to counseling or to have a moment to talk with an advocate, makes that person stronger so that they can overcome a lot of the abuse and the trauma that they've had because of a perpetrator. So why do we need culturally appropriate shelter for our Native women? Well, when you go to a non-Native shelter, a lot of times, of course, the atmosphere is foreign. It's based on a medical model. A lot of times it's too professional or too strict. The staff and other clients make them feel unwelcomed. Too many schedules, having to take classes, sessions that have nothing to do with reasons why they are there. Those are some of the main reasons. The other ones are there's no traditional healing methods, no access to spiritual ritual ceremonies, no understanding of the cultural differences between tribes. Natives have different ways of raising children, felt as punishment instead of a place of safety and comfort. And that's one of the main things and a lot of these comments right here came from victims our native shelters that we have interviewed. And so these are some of the things that they told us, that the reason why they ended up going back to their perpetrator, because it was harder being in the shelter, a non-native shelter, than it was, you know, being at home with their perpetrator. So as tribal native communities, and when you're developing a native shelter, you can build things into it that most other shelters don't. So you can build into your native shelter healing and restorative, cultural, traditional, and spiritual ways, teaching those life skills that they need, establish a sense of protection, safety, empowerment, and teach them to live lives of their own. So you can also, you know, this is very important, because taking it and building it how we want. And one of the things that we were working on is also taking the concept of it being called a shelter and calling it something else. So one of the things that we had worked on with in developing our, because in California with our coalition that I used to be the executive director for, and now I'm on the board, is the Strong Hearted Native Women's Coalition in California in San Diego County, and we started a Native women's shelter. And so we tried to get away from the concept of it being called a shelter, and well, we call it kicha, which in my language means house. But what we're also trying to get away from is to help them help themselves. So we didn't try to keep it in the strict shelter concept. So there's different ways that you can do that and how you want to set that up. And there are different timelines that involve that. So the first one is emergency shelter, which can last from days to a few weeks. The transitional short term is anywhere from a few weeks to 6 months, and sometimes up to a year. The transitional long term is a year to 2 years, and then you have the transitional long term, I guess you could say it. It's a more extensive term, and a lot of times it can be anywhere from 3 to 5 years, that depending on the shelters. And it's not necessarily that they're staying in the shelter, it depends on how you set it up, but most of the time it's that ongoing assistance that you're going to be providing for those clients. So what is actually needed? So when you're thinking, a lot of times, and this is, like I said, these are some things to think about when you're drafting the plans to start a native shelter in your community. If you already have a shelter, these are some things that maybe, hey, I didn't think about that, or hey, that's something we should add into our shelter that we have. But if you're brand new and you're thinking of what you should do, there's the different types of shelters. So if you want to structure your shelter as an emergency shelter only, like I said, that could last anywhere from a couple of days up to a few weeks, maybe a month. And that's to get them out of the situation, get them and the children, if there's children, get them kind of in a safe zone, but also to kind of give them a little bit of stability while they kind of figure things out where they're going to go from there. It might mean that they're going to end up going back to the perpetrator, but sometimes victims just need that time out for themselves, to give them that time to breathe, to figure out what they want to do with their lives. It could also mean putting them up in housing, a hotel or cabin, and you could work with local hotels in the area, or if somebody has a home that they're not using, or working with your tribal housing. If you have a home that is either abandoned or not being used, you can actually transition that into into a shelter for your people. So and make sure to always have a safety plan. Advocacy that would include medical and court advocacy. So having those in place in that first, couple of days up to a few weeks to a month, even sometimes 2 months. Usually I like to say the first 3 months, is because that gives enough time for them to have that downtime to just like be in the shelter and kind of collect their thoughts, have those quiet moments, maybe look at getting some counseling. If they had injuries because of the domestic violence, they may need medical attention, and a lot of times, court advocacy. So if there's children involved, that might constitute getting legal advice for like divorce, child custody, but also if the perpetrator assaulted them and really hurt them, aside from the medical, there might be legal issues because the perpetrator may have been arrested. So there might be all those different things that advocacy is going to have a really big impact on how that's going to help that victim. Transitional shelter is the short term from the few weeks or a couple months up to anywhere to up to the first 2 years. So if you're going to set your shelter up as a transitional shelter, and that short, it could be anywhere from a few weeks up to a few months. I think the average that victims stay in our shelter has been anywhere from a couple of months up to 6 months. And in that time, they're getting counseling, they're getting their life back on track, the kids are getting put into school, they're going through using all the different resources like getting a job or getting their GED, they might be getting put on TANF. They may have child support coming in because if they had court advocacy, they may be in the process of getting divorced. They may be looking for a home. They're filling out applications, setting up checking accounts or savings if they never did that before, learning how those, to budget their money, getting those life skills. They may be taking parenting classes, therapy. They may still be going through getting medical assistance, especially like if they're diabetic or if any of the children or they have other health issues. So there's a lot of things that are going to be taking place in that transitional shelter. So also, in that time, helping them find a place, but you can set up the shelter as if you have a cabin available, an apartment, home. One of our tribes down in California, they actually bought an apartment complex, and so they gave us one of their units as a shelter in that area. So our shelter expanded from the home that we have off reservation that we use as a shelter, as well as the one apartment unit that we had in another location. So we could have multiple locations to be able to utilize different areas of our service area to be able to help victims that were also part of our consortium, so we can offer that more. And that's another idea of being able to, how are you going to make your money stretch? So thinking about those ways of how to bring in other funding sources that could help provide that, helping them enroll the kids in school, like I said, getting work, working on getting the children back if they had been removed. Male children are usually allowed in the native shelters because we allow it in ours, but that's something that you guys would have to look at and build on each individually. So these are just some of the things that, like I said, that we had talked about a little bit earlier. And then a lot of these things kind of keep going on as you're going. So a lot of the same things repeat. But by this time, when we're getting into the long-term area, that's where you're looking at where now the clients are leaving the situation of the shelter and they're trying to become more self-sufficient. So they're having their own place. You might set them up with their first and last month's in security deposit for like an apartment, or you might be helping them find their own place, like an actual house. It's possible that depending on their own tribe's housing authority, what they allow of, like maybe they were on the list to get a tribal house, but at the time they weren't able to get in one, but now they might be be eligible for it. So there's different things to be able to look at that will help those clients to become self-sufficient and sustaining. So when we compare the different types of shelter examples, we'll look at a house. So if your tribe or tribal community has like tribal housing, or maybe there's an abandoned house that could be fixed up to be used as a shelter, depending on the size of the house. I mean, it's more beneficial of the bigger the house, of course, versus a smaller house. If you have a 3-bedroom house, that doesn't offer a lot of shelter for person. So usually we try to look to have either a 4 to 5-bedroom house, but in tribal communities that may not be what is available. So you work with what you have. So it depends on how many are in each family. So I think you would have to look at your tribal codes if the house is on the reservation, if it's off the reservation, which our shelter is. So you also have to look at state codes or the penal codes, you know, and what is involved when you're off the reservation versus on the reservation, to see, you know, how many people can, because you have to follow fire codes and all that stuff. So you have to keep those things in mind, not to overcrowd the house, because if there is an emergency and you want to make sure you're able to get everybody out of the house, people aren't, you know, on top of each other. So you have to look at the fire codes, and if your tribe doesn't have that in regards to the shelter, looking at what is already out there might be something to consider for the tribe to enact and write those codes in, so that way it covers them. You know, most shelters don't allow older children, so when you have your own house, you can kind of allow that to be able to have maybe one the older male children or child to be in another room with so that then they have their own space, but also the younger children are in you know, a different room. So it just kind of gives you a little more when you have a house to be able to have a little bit more leeway in how you structure it. When you're talking about an apartment setting, this could be a little bit different, because then of course you have multiple units, it fits more families, there's more privacy than being in a house. The core of the family function comes back into play, whereas if you're in a house, a lot of times you're dealing with other families and other victims that are in the home as well. So it's hard to establish that core family function, because you're still, you know, it's not their place. So, you know, they have to share it with other people and how they raise their families and their children. When they're in an apartment complex, in a unit, you know, the victims can get a sense of ownership. It empowers them to look forward to finding their own place. A lot of times if you're able to have that, there's safety in numbers, because everybody's there at the same, you know, for the same reason, but they're in those individual housing units. Can set up some units as long-term transitional and some as rentals, so up to 5 years. So if your tribe is able to buy an apartment complex, or maybe there's one already on your reservation that you can be able to set that up as, it just gives you some of those different options. A lot of times when you have an apartments building, there's easy access to stores, transit, schools. A lot of times there's more access to social service providers. There's setups for programs and for the families and kids in the one location. They may have a greater support system, after school programs, childcare, and daycare on site. So there's different things that you can consider having when you have an apartment setting. Creating other types of housing opportunities. Like I said, discuss collaborative efforts between tribes, tribal service providers, and housing authorities and HUD. So that really helps, because with our shelter, we actually work with our local tribal housing authority that is on all the different reservations in our area. And then some of the tribes actually have their own tribal housing authorities. So working and building that network with the different tribal services providers, you know, in your area, as well as, you know, to be able to bring in more people to help provide therapy, to provide maybe putting, doing talking circles or having sweat or any types of traditional types of healing that could be provided through the tribal service providers, having those different housing authorities in HUD working with the different tribes to see, hey, how can we all come together to provide this service for all our people in not only even that tribe, but if there's several tribes in a whole area, think about collaborating and building like a consortium of everybody so that everybody can pool their money. So under our housing authority, they had money set aside specifically for domestic violence services. And so when our shelter needs repairs, we're able to tap into that funding source outside of our FIPSA funding to be able to make those repairs to our shelter. So being able to work together and collaborating and bringing those fundings together really helps sustain a shelter, because you can't do it just on one funding source alone. If the tribe has money and is able to put into it, that's great, but a lot of times the tribe has nothing to do with the actual tribal native shelter. Like our shelter, none of the tribes have direct input with our tribal shelter, but we service all tribal people in our service area. But because we've tapped into the housing through HUD and through the FIPSA services and the tribal service providers, we're able to have a gambit of different things that we're able to provide to the clients in our area. So having monthly meetings or even quarterly meetings with your associate consortium partners is very important to keep those relationships going. So as funding cycles come and go, you're able to work together. Like if you need a tribal resolution for a grant that's coming out, a solicitation, having those relationships to know who to talk to, how to get those resolutions done quickly to be able to submit on behalf of the tribe. There's different ways of working together. And then another thing is also consider using community members' homes. So like, if you have a family member, like say your, auntie or grandma in the community, and, her children are grown and they're out of the house, but she has a, 3 or 4 bedroom home, and, she only needs her 1 bedroom. So maybe those other bedrooms can be used as a quick like shelter, emergency shelter for a victim. So there's different options, talking to those community people, working in your community to figure out how can we work as a community to figure out how we can help our people when they get in these types of situations. Shelter programming for the kids, making sure that there's services for them, counseling, group counseling, house rules. So when you set up your house rules and shared space rules and guidelines, having those guidelines in place, like what about alcohol and mood altering drugs. So like now in a lot of our states, cannabis is now legal. So is that something you're going to allow in your shelter? Is even though alcohol is legal, usually that is not allowed in our shelters. It's not in ours. So those are things you have to have in place. Is how are you going to deal with those situations if a client does violate and brings alcohol or drugs into your shelter? Are they going to be automatically evicted? Are you going to look at sending them and referring them on to somebody else? So there's those guidelines you have to have in place. Confidentiality, what kind of chores are going to be done in the household, even just your dress. So how are you going to have a time that everybody has to be up, nobody's sleeping till noon. But, if they're going to be walking around the house and you have different people coming and going in the house, maybe you have, group counseling going on. So you may have, a male that's coming to the shelter to provide group counseling. So you don't want, girls or young people or even the victims to be walking around in their nightgowns, all day long. So even just having how you're supposed to dress during the day, having like fire safety, how are you going to deal with gossip that's going on? Because we know in our tribal communities how, gossip can really be run rampant. So, just how are you going to deal with things like that? Maintenance, how do you keep up with, what, who's going to clean the kitchen, who's going to clean the living room, having those things in line. Even if the maintenance, the plumbing goes out, who's going to, fix the plumbing. So having that in a place where you have a number of a contact for like a handyman, or if you have a house maiden or house guardian, or somebody who's going to be at the shelter all the time, well, that's who you would bring that to. But if your shelter is pretty much self-sufficient, where you don't have anybody really in the shelter, or if it's after hours, then who do you call when something happens? So just having those kinds of things. Are you going to allow even visitors to the shelter? Because a lot of times shelters, they're confidential locations, but other times it depends on the type of shelter, how you set up. You may have family members that can come and visit. So setting up guidelines and rules about other people coming to the shelter, and even rules about having opposite sex at the shelter. So, are you going to have a common area where people can come visit? Are you going to even allow, if the victim wants to see the perpetrator, is there a restraining order in place? So, that person should not be coming around. But if there isn't a restraining order, and maybe the victim and her partner is trying to work things out, so are you going to allow them to come to the shelter? So those are different things to really consider when you're setting up shelters. Here is a shelter living plan, is kind of a sample of things to kind of think of. It should be in your handout. So these are like I said, some of the things that I went through this is just a basic safety plan, sample plan of what you can consider when you want to have a shelter in your tribal area, whether it's on the reservation or not. And then the other thing is to think of when having a shelter on the reservation versus off the reservation. When it's on the reservation, of course, you follow your tribal codes and things that are on there, but a lot of times our tribal codes aren't up to par with a lot of things. And specifically, if there's never been a shelter, well, then of course, there's not going to be ordinances or codes in place that are going to govern that shelter. So and then if it's off the reservation, then you have additional types of codes and things that you have to be mindful. You have to have insurance, you have to have liability, you have to follow fire codes, you have to follow a lot of other stuff. So those are things to consider, whether, how you want to set that up. And then, like I said, pros and cons. So, when the pros of having your own native specific shelter is that you can tailor it to be however you want it to be. You tailor it to be more native specific, that, can take in, the, traditions and customs, having, being able to smudge, to be able to have talking circles, maybe have a sweat, maybe having, Native American church ceremonies there, maybe having Sundance. So there's so many different things that you can tailor it specific to what your tribe does, or maybe if you have other tribal people from other tribes that are in your area that may be in your shelter. So being able to open it to have something that's a little more generic in, because a lot of tribes will practice sweat, but that may not be traditionally what they do. But because a lot of tribes do that, that might be something to offer that's generic for everybody, enough that, you know, any tribal person, no matter what tribe they're from, may want to participate in that. You have more control of your shelter, because then you get to determine who can come and go, how you want that set up, the benefit to our Native, and it's a benefit to our Native women and children. The cons, of course, is always going to be the cost of running and maintaining a shelter, insurance and liability, and then especially the continued funding. So if you're, you know, the tribal council wants to, you know, get this started and yay, but then, you know, the next election season you get a whole new council in there or leadership, and maybe they don't really care about the shelter. So then how are you going to continue that funding? Because maybe the tribe had put in that first time, but now they're not going to put it in the budget to continue that funding for it. So how are you going to be able to maintain that? So just things to kind of consider. And so some final thoughts is Native specific shelter is needed. So under culture, available to all tribes, make the process about healing, eliminate re-victimization, and it can include all the children, and provide services to the entire family. Access to services. All Native domestic violence programs are included. Access to Indian Health Services. Services can be inclusive to with counseling, substance abuse, and child services, and anything else you can think of that would be a benefit to your clients. Follow-up services is so important. So make sure that victims need continue and ongoing support systems and services for them. Families can have ongoing support and services, including the children and the perpetrator, because that's the one thing that we know about in our tribal communities, is that, you know, the perpetrators, you know, are part of our family, they're part of our community, and we don't want to throw away our people. We want them to heal, we want them to get help, we want them to stop the violence. So you know, and a lot of times our victims end up going back to our perpetrators. So they live in our communities, and even if they don't go back to that victim, but then if they don't get help, they just go on to victimize somebody else, and that's what we need to stop. So being able to also include programs for the perpetrator to help them stop their abusive behavior is very important and is key. And also in all this process, it's not a woman's issue, it's everyone's issue. So the men need to be involved, the women need to be involved, and our tribal leadership needs to be involved, as well as the community as a whole. And you have to also include the children. It's all about healing, because, you know, trauma, it has been affecting us for generations. So if we have generational trauma, we can also have generational healing, and that's what we need to get back to. And so having Native specific shelter is very key to being able to have that generational healing. And so I think I turn it now back over to Lana. Thank you.
Thank you, Jermaine, so much for your wisdom and your knowledge and helping our tribal communities to really think about what we need to do to keep our Native women and children safe. So I just want to end with a couple of slides just to kind of reiterate again that there is no cost for training and technical assistance in any of the areas that we train in, or just even to answer any questions. If you are not currently receiving Office on Violence Against Women funding. So again, I just encourage each and every one of you to contact us if you have any questions. If you don't know if your tribe receives OVW funding, we can look that up for you as well. Next slide. So the next three slides are really focused on the resources that we have on our website that are Tribal Law and Policy Institute created, specifically around domestic violence, sexual assault, and looking at legal codes. So this is around the area of legal codes, looking at sentencing and violence against women enhanced jurisdictions, as well as sexual assault and stalking code, and domestic violence code. Next. We also have specific sexual assault resources that were created to how to set up a tribal sexual assault response team, as well as tribal law enforcement protocol, really understanding what is needed to investigate sexual assault, as well as prosecutor sexual assault protocol. And these are all available on our website. Tribal court judges bench books for sexual assault. These are really handbooks. Oftentimes we don't get to train our judges, so providing them resources is the next best alternative. Next slide. And finally, we have some resources that are specific to having those traditional responses to domestic violence and or sexual assault. Listen to the Grandmothers is a great resource to understand what traditionally tribes did to hold offenders accountable, and what we can do today. Sharing our stories of survival. This is a book about survivors talking about their experiences, but also their healing. And then we have Tribal Domestic Violence Court, and this is a handout that explains setting up a tribal domestic violence court, and then emerging strategies in enforcing tribal protection orders. So next slide. You can go to the next slide. So this is how you can request training and technical assistance or ask any questions. Tribal response at tlpi.org, or contact myself or my colleague, Bonnie Claremont, or visit our website. We also have a tab to request training and technical assistance. And we can do resources and also technical assistance over the phone. And I will turn it over to Jermaine for the last, or to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for attending. And once again, my name is Jermaine Omish-Lucero. I'm the Special Projects Director for the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence. And you can reach me also at jermainel@atcev.org.
And Chia, did we have any questions?
So I don't see any questions, but I also apologize because it seems like my version of the GoToWebinar is really acting up with some technical difficulties. So I don't see any, and I would just, oh, okay, well, I guess I do get them. Someone just had a comment that they thanked us for, said it was great information. So I don't see any other questions, but I guess if anyone does have a question, please feel free to email Jermaine or Lana or Bonnie. And again, the slides are listed on the handouts, which are the second to last topic here on your dashboard. And also, again, I would like to encourage everyone to go ahead and fill out the survey that we have that pops up at the end as you close the webinar. And, oh, okay, we do have a question here. Let me see if I can. What are good resources for training victim specialists now that we get OVC money?
Let's see. Well, for that kind of training, are you talking, well, I guess it would be if they're specific to domestic violence or sexual assault, because as an advocate, you have to have the different types of training. I know when I had my training, I had to have 40 hours of domestic violence, and I had to have 72 hours of sexual assault training. So to become an advocate, and so depending on what you're specifically looking at when you're talking about a specialist, I mean, are you talking specifically domestic violence, sexual assault? That would be my first question.
I don't see any follow-up to that. Maybe they can email you, Jermaine, or Lana specifically if they have something to follow up.
Yeah.
And I don't see, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, if they can email me more specific, I can try to answer them a little bit more detailed. Because when you say a specialist, that can mean anything. Because I mean, even if you're talking about SART or legal responses, then well, that's a little out of my purview for the legal part. But so when you're asking about specialist training, being a little more specific would be helpful.
And I would just share that, along with the specialist or victim specialist, I think that can really mean a number of entities or advocacy, and specifically if they're community advocates, they're working within the community in a nonprofit or outside of the tribal government realm, and really have, I think, a few more confidentiality protections for victim and advocates versus maybe a victim advocate who works within a prosecution or law enforcement capacity, because their job is really to assist during, prosecution or the length of the case that goes through court, and not necessarily the communication between the victim and the advocate is necessarily protected and can be used for prosecution. So I would just also think about where the advocate or specialist is situated.
Yes, that's very important.
Thank you both. I don't see, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so if there are no other questions, I really, again, wanted to thank Jermaine for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. And I really am encouraged when we talk about having shelters on our community reservations and our lands, because I think it really speaks to that sovereignty issue, but also really responding to the needs of victims from a more cultural and protocol response. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And thank you to all the participants who listened to our webinar from all over the country. And thank you to Chia for assisting us today. And thank you, everyone. And I would just encourage you again to request training and technical assistance, request if your tribe is receiving OVW funding, or just to reach out to us to answer any questions in depth. So thank you all for attending. Wopita Tonka.
Thank you.